So I can say, no, I know real men who not only have overcome this problem, but are years removed and living in purity and holiness, now pouring their lives out to care for others.
This is the Into the Light podcast, where we ask experts, hear authors, and listen to stories about pornography, sexuality, and the Christian life. This podcast is part of the teaching documentary, also called Into the Light. I'm your host, John Michael Bout, and I hope that through this conversation, you meet Jesus, find healing, and have your honest questions answered. Deepak, thank you for joining me on this podcast and for just being part of this film in general.
Yeah.
We were kind of saying it before, but you were the first person we got on, and God really used that to open the floodgates for the rest of the speakers to come along. So thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to do it.
Just kind of a little bit of how we're going to do this. We're already talking about this. I just want to talk to you a little bit about what's your personal story, where you are in your ministry, and then kind of how you got there. So first off, where are you serving? Wife, family, kids, things like that.
Yeah. I'm serving as a pastor at Capitol Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. I've been at the church since 1991, but I've been on staff now as a pastor since 2007, so the last 15 years.
Okay.
And married to Sarah, who I met here over 20 years ago. So 21 years ago we met when I was Mark Dever's personal assistant, and she had just joined as a member. Had become converted a few years earlier and come to DC and was baptized the month before I joined staff. And we dated that year, then I went to seminary and dated long distance, and then we got engaged and married the following year.
So you met at Capitol Hill Baptist?
We met at Capitol Hill, and she followed me to Southern Seminary, where she did her MDiv while I finished PhD, and we started having kids there at Southern when we were in really the first stage of our marriage. And then we have 5 kids. So Zach is our oldest, 17, Lydia, 15, Eden, 13, Noelle is 10, and our youngest, Abe, is 8 years old. So we have boys on the bookend and the girls, 3 girls in the middle. Okay. And it's a ton of fun.
So now you're at Capitol Baptist. What does your role look like? I know we were talking about this a bit before you are talking with interns, you're doing practical counseling, and you're writing books. What has your role been there?
Yeah. Well, the thing they pay me to do is to be a pastor, so be a shepherd. And unlike a lot of staffs where you're narrowed into a particular niche and that's all you do, we're hired as generalists. So I should do everything from lead public worship services, which I did 2 weeks ago, to preach on a Sunday evening, which I did a few weeks before that, to do membership interviews, be involved in church discipline cases, to do counseling, to teach Sunday school classes, to officiate weddings, to officiate funerals, all of which I've done over the past year, let alone the last few years. And yet, each of us has particular areas that we try to lead out on behalf of the staff. So the obvious area for me to lead is in counseling to help out, which doesn't mean I'm a vacuum and I suck up all the hard cases. So the staff do a wonderful job in taking on some of the really difficult things that are going on in the church. And I'm there to come alongside the other pastors. So I lead out in some situations, but then I help with the staff in being invested in helping equip our elders and help our staff to grow. But then the unique thing I think that they asked me to do that's different than another generic pastor is they asked me to show up and equip the congregation. So that's the first thing in my job description, not just to do the counseling, but to equip the congregation to change the nature of the culture in the church. So that the DNA of the church would change over time so that shepherding, caring for others, being invested in the hard cases would be a normal and natural part of what we do as a church. And so I'm helping the day-to-day members be involved in hard things. I'm trying to help them not back away when they hear scary things like suicide or a troubled marriage or an eating disorder or a pornography addiction, but instead move towards someone who's struggling because you're covenant members of the same church. And so you have a commitment to care for each other. So we're getting away from the notion that professional pastors have the responsibility for the herding sheep alone. Pastors do have a shepherding responsibility to care for the herding sheep, but the members also have a responsibility to care for those who are in the congregation with them. And the easiest way to prove that is just simply look at the one another text. The one another text in Scripture trace out the relationship of Christians one to the other and the responsibility of Christians to care for, exhort, love, protect, watch over, pray for, love on, and be invested in other Christians within the same local church.
I feel like there's this fear of taking counseling courses because it's like, I'm not that kind of person. Like, you have to be a special person to counsel. So it's interesting that you guys are trying to merge that with discipleship, because I'm seeing the connection that you're saying. Like, would you say that you're teaching counseling kind of alongside discipleship because that's what you think the one another texts are getting at?
Yeah, I would say discipleship, and in fact, what we often use as a terminology of a culture of discipling, is foundational to what I'm talking about right now. So you don't have to have any special skills to be able to open up the Bible and pray with someone. You just need the Spirit dwelling within you and a desire to do spiritual good to someone else. And yet, in that, let's just say we have a continuum, and the banner over that continuum is the idea of discipling, being invested in another person for the sake of their spiritual good. Well, on one end of that continuum is the hard cases, the difficult, nasty things in the Christian life that are really difficult for us to deal with, and yet we don't want just the professionals to be the ones involved in that part of the continuum. We want the members to be a part of that because that's a part of our investment in each other. And so therefore, I'm putting counseling as a subset of discipling. It's the time-specific, problem-focused, more directed area of discipling that deals with the hardest parts of the Christian life. And therefore, it's not some subspecialty that only uber-trained people can do. Now, I do like the fact that there are people who have trained and gotten equipped and are especially gifted to deal with those hard cases. I spent years learning how to do this, and yet I don't want just the professionals to be handling those hard cases. If nothing else, like, what on earth do we mean when we're talking about gospel community?
Right.
We're not just talking about Bible study only, we're talking about life on life. And if you've ever been involved in another Christian's life, you run into suffering eventually. You run into hard things. So the question is not whether you're going to run into it, it's when you're going to run into it, and when you run into it, are you going to be ready? Are you going to be equipped to know how to handle some of those hard things and come alongside a fellow believer who you probably know and even love and want to be committed to? And so this is a way to be committed to them. Are you trying to replace the elder or the counselor? No. But are you trying to be one part of the system that God has seemed to design in being a church community together, where we are a compelling supernatural community that desires to see the gospel come to fruition in every person's life? And that's what we're trying to do.
I feel like that comes out a little bit. We got to visit the service last night.
Yeah.
Just in the way that you had different people praying for, like, a need comes up, this member, can you pray for that? And just the sense that it's not just the pastoral care that is caring for each other.
Yeah.
The church coming around alongside each other and wrapping each other around in that. Just to kind of transition to another section, I don't know if there's any like hopeful stories you would want to share of people that you've counseled with. I'm just putting you on the spot right now with that.
Yeah.
But
No, there are tons of stories. There are folks who I have seen, let's just use a name like Darren. You know, when I first encountered Darren was mired in pornography, and it was actually Garrett, when he was on our staff, who came to me and said, man, we need to pour into this guy and help him out. So I jumped on a call with Garrett as we talked through with Darren about his struggle with pornography. And as it's typical for me, I want to take the long game. A guy who's mired in pornography and hopeless at the beginning, you know, something as simple as just beginning to teach them how to deal with access points often brings a quick injection of hope because they've never thought through carefully what that looks like. That often shifts the game pretty quickly. But what you often see is it moves from the external, the battle with temptation, the battle with looking at illicit material. And once you shut that down and slow down the consumption of illicit material, the battle shifts inward. And the war really gets to be centered around your heart. And the battle with mind and fantasy and heart issues becomes the central battlefront in helping someone then finally defeat pornography over the long term. And so in Darren's case, I saw that. Like, we taught him how to shut things down. But, he struggled. I mean, he would have long weekends where he'd binge and come and confess to us after the long weekend. And so part of me helping him was beginning to teach him to let us in earlier, to let us know as soon as he begins to struggle, not wait until afterwards, which is a common bad habit, to confess after you binged on something. I want to know when the battle has begun. I want to know when they're first thinking about it, when they're first aroused, when they're first struggling. And so that was the first big, I felt, major step that I saw in Darren as he started to change. He started to let me in earlier so we can do battle together.
In the book Finally Free, there's the acronym CAR, Confess, Affirm, Request.
Yeah.
And I found that such a helpful thing, because it's how do you respond first and afterwards, just as a helpful, nugget I've taken out of that book for thinking about confessing, affirming who God is, and then requesting help from other people right away before, and then if there's failure afterwards as well.
Yeah.
But I didn't mean to cut you off on that.
Yeah. Darren got to a really good spot in fighting the battle. We worked at it for not just months, but a year or two in the struggle. And in the midst of it, when he got to a really good spot, he said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, I'm really interested in this girl." And so the whole issue of dating and are you ready came up. We worked through that together to make sure all the godly men in his life felt like he's in a good spot to move forward with that. And then he did. He initiated with a young lady in the congregation. And what a delight to be able to begin to walk through the next few stages with him in helping him think through dating. And then they got married, and then they started having kids. And yet, Darren's peril has not forever been gone. He stumbled in marriage. That was a hard thing for his wife. We've been working through that. And it's been a good thing to see that he's been open and honest, transparent with men, transparent before God, and transparent before his wife in working through some of these things. And so therefore, if Darren had gotten married without dealing with any of these things, their marriage would be a wreck. But we did the due diligence of helping him deal with this in order to make sure that he was in a much better spot before he ever started to think about dating.
Right. That's great. What are some, just thinking for listeners, we're committed to also talking about this from a woman's perspective and just the struggle that is. What are some good resources specifically oriented towards women and just, bringing that into the light and lowering the shame that's there?
Yeah, a couple of things I would commend. If you go to Harvest USA's website, they actually have a number of resources, including curriculum for women discipling women, to help women who are struggling with any kind of sexual sin, including pornography issues. I've become a big fan of Jessica Harris and a lot of her material. She has several books and a lot of content on her website. And I'd commend that because she's one of the few women who herself struggled significantly as an addict, has come out of it on the other side, and has been very open and been helping a lot of other women with this issue. And then thirdly, Rescue Plan in our the book that Jonathan Holmes and I did, we have not only a chapter focused on women struggling, but we try and put illustrations of men and women in both Rescue Plan, our first book, and Rescue Skills, the second book we wrote on this, to give lots of illustrations on what it looks like for a woman to overcome this struggle.
Yeah, totally. I think that kind of connects into our film is talking about pornography specifically, but I guess on this podcast we want to also talk about just broadening that out. And how do you approach when you're talking about issues of sexuality with men or women when it's all muddled up? Because like you were saying a little bit before, pornography is not in a vacuum. There's always mixed up thing. The human heart is connected with that. But just kind of thinking, how do you talk about and deal with the project with things like BDSM, hookup culture, failing marriages, and child abuse, just different things like that that are all interconnected of sexual hurts, but need to be dealt with differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I love David Paulson's imagery of a tree, and there are different roots connected to a tree, and there are different things that are involved when you look at the different branches and the bad fruit that's born from it. And to recognize that if you just narrow down this issue to simply a lust problem, you're narrow-minded in your approach to the issue of pornography addictions. There's a lot that can go on that builds into a person's addiction. So for example, if you think about someone who's struggled with pornography and yet had a background, say, of like child abuse, often pornography is not the main issue. It's the hurt and the trauma that came about through the child abuse, and pornography is just a secondary symptom to that hurt and trauma. So if you just take an approach of dealing with the addiction, and you don't deal with the trauma that they experience, then ultimately you're not getting to the root of that tree. And so we often find that if we get adequate help for someone who's experienced trauma, well, the porn issue would then begin to take care of itself, because that was a secondary bad fruit manifestation of the primary issue of the trauma. And there's a lot of things that are interconnected like that, where you see it's not just a lust problem. And another word picture that David Paulson would often use would be a multiplex theater and multiple screens playing within that theater. And so theater number one may be the lust issue, but theater number two is anger at God. Theater number three are issues, say, with a biological father. Theater number four might be stress at work. Theater number five may be issues with a teenager. There are a lot of things that add up to a person's life. And so if you just do screen number one, which is the lust issue with pornography, because that's the main show, then you're losing sight of the fact that we're complicated human beings and we're interconnected. All those roots are connected to the same tree. Sorry, I'm combining word pictures here.
I'm tracking.
But all those screens are playing in the same theater. And so we have to take a holistic approach. If I deal with the anger issue at God or the difficulty with that teenager, and you find God's redemption in that, you find gospel hope in it, you see change in there, well, you're not surprised that all of this is interconnected. And so therefore, it's like throwing a rock in a pond. There are ripples, and those ripples have an effect on a person's heart and their life. So if I can help someone in their issue with their teenager, issue in their marriage, issue of their relationship with the Lord, you got to believe it's going to affect my struggles with pornography. So I want to keep in mind the interconnectedness of a person's life and not have a very narrow view of their sin.
Totally. The sixth section of our film, which Garrett is going to be taking, is kind of that. Pornography is not in a vacuum. There's so many other things that interplay with it, and that chapter is going to end up being like more focused on the hopeful end of it, not so much on the trauma and things like that, but just kind of talking about how defeating pornography doesn't mean reaching, I guess, your greatest, but like now you're completely holy. It's one sin and it's one struggle that's connected with so many other things. We talked a bit about this before. We did a survey on just general questions that someone would want to put to a counselor or expert. And I was struck by how many were on masturbation. Just a difficult topic to talk about, even more taboo than pornography to talk about. And something that I've heard pastors talk about pornography off the pulpit, but very rarely talk about masturbation. So I just got a whole slew of questions, but
go ahead, shoot.
Let me just pull one out. One is, put simply, is there ever a time that masturbation is morally ambiguous? Is masturbation a sin? This is kind of, a lot of things flow out of this, but how do you generally approach masturbation?
So I think it is a sin and a problem when it's solo sex. And the way to frame it, to think about it theologically, is I think if you understand God's purposes for sex, which is to foster intimacy between a man and woman and to create unity between them within a marital context, then you begin to see that masturbation is essentially self-pleasure, self-gratification for myself, and that's not a part of God's design. So that's where I think theologically we begin with that. I hear, I read, I talk to a lot of people on this issue, and there's a lot of confusion because there are plenty of people who make arguments like, well, masturbation is not in the Bible, and therefore it's not a problem. Or God never speaks about it, and so it's a morally neutral category, so therefore go for it.
I was going to ask you about this later.
Yeah, well, and so the confusing thing is like, well, not every version of sexual sin is in the Bible. It's a bad argument to begin with, and what we need to think about also is, what does that lead me to? If it leads me to shame and guilt, and what's going on in my heart? What's the motivation? If this is just self-pleasure, self-gratification is my motivation, well, I've got a lot of issue with that because it doesn't seem like masturbation is leading me down a good path. So fundamentally, there's a lot of reasons we can spell out why masturbation is an issue, but fundamentally, does it fit with God's design? I don't think it does. If you understand what the purposes of sex are, which is not just pleasure and procreation, which is what most commonly people list, and those are parts of God's purposes for sex. But what they miss is the intimacy that fosters unity within the context of a marital covenant. Why does God give us sex? Is so we can learn to be one unit together. And that's a picture of actually the unity that there is when we're united to Christ. That kind of intimacy that we want to have with our spouse is a real gift that God gives us and is a part of his basic design.
I guess a follow-up question would be, I've had people say, all right, we'll give you that, but what about something like going part way, not fully acting out on that, but the gratification of going part way, or even nocturnal emissions. That's, I think, another area where confusion comes in. When is it sinful? When is it, sexual dreams? I'm throwing a lot of things here.
Yeah. So let's just take like part way. I can arouse myself a little bit, but not go all the way to climax. And is that a problem? Well, sex in any form, and I'll say, hugging, holding hands, kissing is one side. That's not sinful. Intercourse is clearly sinful if it's not my spouse. There's a wide range of stuff in between, which is called messing around. All kinds of things that we can do, including beginning to arouse myself and not climax, the kind of sexual interactions I can have with another person that is not intercourse. There's a lot of things that are meant to lead me to the place of intercourse. There's a purpose behind it. And so if I am trying to just begin to stimulate myself but not finish it off, it's like I'm playing with fire. I'm beginning to head down a pathway. Well, let's put it this way. A word picture that we often use is a on-ramp to a highway. All those things that fit in that messing around category is meant to get me to the highway of sexual intercourse. And who stalls on the on-ramp? No one. I mean, you got lots of cars behind you trying to get on that on-ramp honking at you if you tried to do that. Well, you're meant to head in a particular direction as you're doing all that. So again, it gets back to the purposes. What's the point of that? You can't just be a behaviorist and revolve around the action. If I stimulate myself a little bit and I feel a little bit good, but I don't climax, I'm okay. Well, no. I mean, I don't know many people who can do that and stop it there, number one. Number two, what's the purpose behind it? What is God's intentions? It's to get me to a place where I can have intercourse with someone who is my spouse so we can foster unity and build a better marriage. I think that's God's purposes.
Yeah. And then I guess one of the other ones, what about nocturnal emissions, something where it is not self-brought on, often connected with sexual dreams?
Yeah, and so sexual dreams, and ejaculate and didn't intend to do that in the middle of the night, yeah, we're going to deal with a couple of things. Like for number one, trashy minds and trashy hearts are going to spell out in the unconscious. It's going to work out its way. So what you were filling yourself up with right before you went to sleep, or what generally your life is being filled with, is going to literally spell out in what happens even when you're unconscious. So the question for me is not to put any shame or guilt on the person who has a nocturnal emission, because there's an unconscious act right there, but it's to look at the rest of your life and look at the content of the rest of your life. And if you're, junk in, junk out. You fill yourself up with trash, all kinds of illicit material, it's going to spill out into the bad fruit of your life. And it's going to show up in lots of different ways, even in your unconscious activity in the middle of the night.
Yeah, totally. This kind of connects to my next question, but I've had so many people say, like, I cannot help but masturbate. Like, it's just a natural bodily function that has to happen. In which case, I've always been like, God has designed our bodies to release in a natural way, which is nocturnal emissions. But I had someone put a question where masturbation is sometimes thought as a God-given tool for the celibate to fight temptation or even to fight pornography. Like, how do you counsel on someone who says something like that? This is a God-given tool for me to, fight discontentment as a single person or to stay away from pornography.
Yeah. What that's saying is God's means for me to fight discontentment and to satisfy myself sexually is masturbation. And that seems to sideline holiness. It just throws it out the window in just saying, there is no means for God to give me a kind of purity of heart and mind. And I just don't want to buy that, because I think holiness is clearly in the Bible. And what does God say? Be holy as I am holy. He repeats that commandment many times in Scripture. And so holiness is the priority in my mind. And so therefore, I don't want to use means that God intends for things like marriage and try and procure it in some version of singleness to satisfy me because I'm so discontent. Rather, what I'd like to do is pursue contentment and holiness and then put those kinds of means in the right context.
Right. And then I guess kind of one of the other things is, what about sexual dreams? I think that's kind of covered with nocturnal emissions.
Yeah.
What you're injecting or what you're taking in will come out in the subconscious.
Yeah, and that's, so, in pornography, once you get overwhelmed with it and your life is overrun by it, you've filled up your heart and your mind with so much junk that you're not surprised that you're going to have sexual dreams in the middle of the night. Because what's going on, you've got your imagination, which is a part of your image-bearing qualities, part of function of who you are as an image bearer, and your sinful flesh, both reaching into your mind and grabbing all the images you have stored up in there. And like an artist, some of these professional artists who, you ever see a canvas and they take paint and just throw it on the canvas? Yeah. I think that's essentially what your imagination and sinful flesh is doing with these middle of the night dreams that are fantasies that you weren't planning for. It feels a little bit unconscious. But no, I think what you do in your conscious life feeds in. Because you've stored up all those memories. If your imagination and your carnal flesh didn't have anything to draw on, there wouldn't be much to imagine in the middle of the night. There'd be less to draw on. But you've got such a data bank of memories and images, you've just provided a lot to go on in the middle of the night. So trashy mind, trashy heart, trashy dreams. You should just be surprised that that's the bad fruit that spills out, which means the prescription is not magic. It's like, no, clean up your life. And somebody's going to say to me then, well, I've got lots of those images still stored up there. Well, if you fight this battle of holiness, those things will drift to the background. There's a kind of purity process as you're fighting the addiction, where at the front end of it, a guy's minds are overwhelmed with these kinds of thoughts. And they're overrun all day with this. They feel like they can't help it. Well, if you begin to fight this battle, you begin to kill the desires, you begin to learn how to fight temptation, you begin to walk in more holiness and purity, you'll see over the course of time that that mind begins to get cleared up. And the images begin to move to the background, and it doesn't have as much of a grip on you. But that takes time. You've got to keep in the fight. And you got to persevere, and you can't do it on your own. You need other people to help you to do that.
So I guess just kind of broadly on the topic of masturbation, I feel like it's already more taboo than pornography, but I think it's less taboo for men. On top of that, it seems to be even more taboo for women.
Yeah.
How do you talk about that? And I guess I don't know if you do counseling with women, but just what's your approach for counseling with women with that as well?
Yeah. So masturbation is like the stepchild of the big issue of pornography. Pornography is the red letter sin. You know, it's the main show. It's the one that draws all the attention. And pornography, because we know it's connected to the issues, masturbation, because we know it's connected to the issue of pornography. It often is a problem with pornography, and that's pretty common for men. Interestingly, masturbation for women doesn't have to be connected to pornography. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes masturbation is an issue unto itself. A woman can struggle with masturbation and it has no connection to pornography. And so she's struggling with sexual sin. So I counsel mostly men. I counsel some women on this issue. I have a team of ladies on my staff who counsel a lot of women on this issue. And I supervise and talk to them a lot about how to help. So I've helped women myself. I've helped women with their disciplers. I've helped counselors who are helping the women and the disciplers. So I've heard a lot of women speak about this. We want men and women in the fight so that they understand what the battle looks like by fighting for holiness, fighting for purity. And so you don't have to be a woman who's struggling with pornography. You can be a woman who's addicted to masturbation and can't seem to slow it down. And that might be the thing that you need help with. And yet, who talks about this? Nobody. So one of the ladies who works for me talked about how she was in a conversation with a woman who was beginning to hint at it. She could tell that the young lady was embarrassed to talk about it. So she just called it out. She said, are you struggling with masturbation? And there was a sense of relief from that woman, like, oh, it's like I'm being given permission to now talk about it openly. I'm sure there's a lot of women who struggle that way with it, and a lot of men, because nobody talks about masturbation. And yet, read stuff on the internet, there's a lot of confusion, because there are people all over the board on how to think about this issue. And so we want to help people understand, we do think outside of marriage, the solo sex, masturbation is a problem, but, you know, if you're hiding, if you are hiding and struggling with it, there is help. There are people who want to help you with it, and you don't have to struggle with this alone. So some guys struggle with masturbation and pornography. They get over the pornography, and they're still struggling with masturbation. And so we want to help you with that. And often with that, you all see then ladies who are struggling with pornography and masturbation, and so we want to help you with both of those. But ladies who are struggling just with masturbation, we want to help them also not feel left out of this conversation.
Just practically, you just did a chapter on cutting off access to pornography. With masturbation, that's obviously a lot harder.
Yeah.
How do you practically counsel people when access is essentially constantly there? What are the ways to, when there's temptations and cravings, to get away from those things when it's carried with you?
Well, the first practical means, for example, is identifying the danger zones where a person typically gets trapped in wanting to act out in masturbation. So, for example, lingering in a shower too long, or staying in bed either late at night or early in the morning too long. We begin to work the danger zones out of their life so that they don't linger at the places where they're most vulnerable. So in a shower, quick showers. And you're transparent about this. So you got to get this out in the open so that other people in your inner circle are talking to you about it. And so I would ask an accountability partner to, for example, if I'm the struggler, to check on me in regards to showers and ask me. So if they're asking me, they're checking on whether I'm struggling with it. They're putting a good pressure on my life to make sure. But then I can do practical things, 5-minute showers. If I'm lingering for 10, 15, 20 minutes, it's going to cause trouble. And when I linger like that, I usually run into trouble. As an addict, I need to put limits on myself. and accountability partners help you with that. Same thing, like in the morning. If I'm lingering in the bed and I'm beginning to fantasize, then I'm going to often act out. So I need to not linger in the bed. So we want to adjust the danger zones practically to help people understand how to deal with that. Secondly, we got to get it out in the open. To deal with it, we just got to talk about it. And if a discipler, accountability partner, best friend is not asking me, then I need to do the awkward thing and bring it up. And tell them about my issue, ask them to help me pray about it and think through it, and come up with strategies like I just mentioned. Where do I need to begin to adjust? Thirdly, you got to begin to decide what a theology of sexuality is. You got to begin to understand what God's purposes are. And if you don't see the bigger picture, then you're going to be really confused on what the place is of masturbation and over theology of sexuality. Fourthly, what you want to do is begin to understand the connection between pornography and masturbation. For most men, there is a clear connection between it. Usually I look at pornography and then I finish it off with masturbation. That means if I can deal with the porn problem, it helps with masturbation, but it's not perfect, because sometimes I deal with the porn problem, and what does the sinful flesh do? It finds other ways to work out the desires that have taken over my life. And if it can't get access to porn anymore, then masturbation is a way to do that, where I start fantasizing in my mind and then acting out with masturbation. And that's a way to deal with it when pornography has now been put to rest, by still satisfying my flesh in ways that it wants the desires to be carnally worked out. So just a couple of ways to start thinking about. There's a lot more other ways that we traced out in a real practical, strategic chapter within the Book of Rescue Plan.
Great. Just for time's sake, we're going to kind of turn to real people's questions. So I'm just going to kind of throw these out. I went through all the questions that we got through this form, and I kind of divvied them out to different people. So some more masturbation ones, but just some general counseling ones. This one we already covered. Is it possible to masturbate and it not be a sin as a single person? If so, what about married? Maybe just touch more on the married part and how that interconnects.
Yeah. So obviously, if you're not degrading an image bearer or doing anything that is immoral or inappropriate to someone else, then there's a lot of freedom within sexuality to be creative. The intercourse is the obvious thing that we all understand, but there's a lot of things that a couple can do to enjoy one another and do that. And in real life, there are times in marriage where intercourse is not possible. So for example, after a wife gives birth to a baby, especially if there were biological medical issues that caused an episiotomy, which is the snipping of it, the wife is going to need to heal for 6 to 8 weeks after they sew her up, after that delivery. That means there's no intercourse for 2 months. And that can be hard on a marriage. Well, masturbation is a way that a husband and wife can help please one another in a small and limited season in which they can't have intercourse. So that's where I want to leave a lot of freedom for a husband and wife to be able to help please one another. And masturbation can fit within the context of a covenant relationship where a husband and wife is intended and are committed to one another and intending to help each other enjoy that kind of gratification.
Yeah. Another one, this is first a comment, then sort of a question. What if pastors and leaders put as much emphasis on telling people not to masturbate as they tell them not to watch pornography? I have heard don't watch porn off the pulpit, but never don't masturbate. There are groups online who found success by overcoming pornography by trying not to masturbate. What do you think about this? Are there ways to talk about this from the pulpit?
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
Okay. Well, and so yes, we need to be inclusive in our messaging in talking about sexual sin. What's hard is strugglers want to hear more, and yet pastors have to shepherd everybody. So part of the issue there, and you guys now being parents, is young children being given words and terms that their parents haven't even told them. So that's part of the dilemma in that. So we do need to think of ways to equip the people in our pews. We have to, and there are lots of ways to do it. So the pulpit is pretty expansive. The pulpit's not just demanding that the person preaching the sermon has something to say about masturbation. I mean, we teach a class on Sunday mornings that deal with all kinds of issues, including dealing with issues of sexual sin. And in a Sunday school class with adults is a great spot to be able to talk about addiction and masturbation. Not in a Sunday morning setting. It's a little bit harder. I don't think impossible, but a little bit harder when you have lots of little children sitting there and introduced to words and terms that their parents haven't even equipped them with. So in that sense, I got to think as a shepherd, I got to think about everybody in the room in that regard and think about the best context. So I'm all for us being more clear on this issue and even more clear from the leadership on this issue. And hence, I've dedicated myself as a pastor to talking about it, writing about it, speaking about it. So I'm all in on that. Yeah. And yet, for the strugglers who say, we need to hear more from the pastor, from the pulpit. That, well, yes, you're not thinking like a pastor then. Think about, we got to shepherd everybody who's in the pew. And so as a parent, you start thinking about this a little bit differently, about introducing it early, helping it be developmentally sensitive, helping kids understand sexuality, like helping them grow up in it, helping them warn them against the dangers, just all the things that are there.
I mean, from myself, my introduction to the term came from an unwise placement of that. So I'm a living testament to curiosity coming out in the wrong area, and that also the danger of that. Two kind of connected ones, but when you're counseling people through pornography, how do you differentiate between pornography, sketch material, and non-lustful images that are just being thought of in a lustful way?
Yeah, so let's just use the hard porn, the illicit content, the content that we all know is troubling, and then I'll use the terminology soft porn. So a person who's scantily dressed but not revealing any nudity, but they reveal a lot of skin. There are ways in which if we cut off all the access to hard porn, that we naturally drift towards soft porn and can even self-justify looking at things that in our own minds we say, well, that's not illicit material. And yet what are we doing? We're arousing or stimulating ourselves. We're beginning us down that pathway that heads us towards things that we shouldn't be doing or thinking about overall. And so that what you said, sketchy material, I just put as like soft porn. And I would say we shouldn't be looking at that. Someone who's struggling with hard pornography is putting themselves in a perilous spot if they're looking at soft porn too. What was your third one?
And then the third one was just like non-lustful images that are being looked at in a way that is with lust. So just an image that's not sexual at all.
Yeah. Well, and that then becomes an issue of the heart. It's not an issue of the imagery. So, I can look at a beautiful painting of a woman, and yet if I am lusting after her, it's not the painting that's the issue, it's my heart. And, we can go through 1,000 scenarios where it's not the external circumstances, because there's lots of things in the Christian life that's not illicit material. And yet how I deal with it in my heart is actually the primary problem.
Like, what is pornography? What's the dividing line between pornography and acceptable media? Thinking with films, movies, shows, things like that.
It's a great question. So here's my definition. Pornography is an addiction to sexual sin that overtakes a person's life. The person who has embraced pornography views naked people through images or videos. For their own selfish pleasure, men and women arouse themselves by viewing someone else's nakedness and usually also their sexual acts. Nakedness and sex are exposed, selfishly exploited, and consumed by a bystander who is not the husband or wife of the person or people involved. So that gives a basic sense of what we think not just addiction is, but pornography addiction is overall. In regards to that explicit content and the content that we find in social media, in movies and other things like that, anything that is illicit, so the hard porn, or the soft porn, the stuff that we'll just nickname as tantalizing and very revealing. You can't just view an R-rated movie and justify because the scene is brief that it's okay. That's another way for the carnal flesh to consume things that are not good for your soul. So you need to create a hard line that takes all of that out. What does that mean for then social media or movies or other kinds of online content that you can view? It means you have to be careful. You have to draw out clear lines that are good for your soul and not good for your soul. And any kind of content that's illicit like that is not good for you. And you need to be careful, like I said earlier, like the hard stuff, if you cut it out of your life, we often see people who are addicted drift to the soft stuff, the stuff that's not as illicit. That's a natural tendency to self-justify bringing those in. And so you just need to create a hard line of what you're going to cut out. And that means denying yourself access to certain social media, certain kinds of movies, in order to protect yourself from yourself and preserve the pathway towards purity and holiness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saved some of the kind of really practical questions for the last ones. Just boots on the ground. What are the triggers and everyday temptations people are struggle with pornography deal with? And then kind of pair that with another one. How can I help someone who's close to me who's struggling with pornography? Just really practical things.
Yeah, first thing, like triggers, unfortunately in an over-sexualized society, they're everywhere. So for example, a trigger could be I'm walking down the street and a woman is dressed in a fairly illicit outfit. And so therefore, it begins this process of stirring my body, stirring feelings within me, provoking thoughts in my mind that heads me down a pathway towards me acting out that night. And so any kind of illicit content that I run into in over-sexualized culture that really, like right now, loves to reveal itself and display its nakedness, then that's troubling for me. And it can create a trigger, which is something that sets me off down that pathway towards beginning to lust, desire, hope for things that are not good for my own soul. So really, as I fight that battle, I need to understand my triggers. What are the things that are troubling for me that I typically run into? What do I mean by that? Because I can't protect against every woman who's walking down the street in the sense of knowing what's going to happen, when that's going to happen. But I can, for example, adopt habits that are good to protect me. Like when that woman comes, the moment I see it, I'm not in sin, but if I linger, I am. And so I need to learn to look down and look away to protect my own heart. Or I had a guy, on his drive home, he would pass by billboards that had people illicitly dressed. So to help protect him from being triggered when he drove by that, we created longer pathways on the way home. And that was a way just to protect his heart and avoiding that illicit material. So you want to think about practical ways that are helpful to protect you from those triggers.
Right. And when in the moment of temptation, what are some good methods for fighting kind of at that transition point, like you're saying, where it's either a linger and turn towards sin, where temptation gives birth to sin? Just what are some practical things, helpful Bible passages, steps to take with accountability partners, just general stuff in that moment of temptation?
Yeah. So, for example, Romans 8, if God is for me, who can be against me? Or nothing can separate me from the love of Christ. I so love those texts. I need to be soaking in them so that when I hit the moment of temptation, I have a storehouse of gospel truth that fortifies me when the evil one attacks. Then in the moment, I need to, one, have the habits of life that allow me to begin to avoid the temptation. Number two, I need to pray because I need God's help in that moment. And number three, I need to be humble enough to let other people know I'm struggling. Because often in the moment of temptation, it just begins the process of me heading towards acting out. It's just the start of a process that gets me to that point. And so if I'm willing to be humble enough to let other people in, I can begin to cut off that process overall in fighting the battle against temptation. And then I also need to be wise about myself. I understand what are the seasons that I'm particularly sensitive to things, where my heart is at, where I'm vulnerable in my own life. So having self-awareness of my own weaknesses, my own frailties, are really important in understanding how to do that battle.
Yeah. Are there any, this is kind of taking a little bit of a different turn, but are there any resources that can be useful to parents to make sure their children cannot access pornographic material online? And then how does, maybe I compare these, how does pornography and child abuse meet in church? Do you think there's a pairing between those things?
So what we need is to get out ahead of it with our children and help them to understand God's purposes for sex so that the culture doesn't educate our kids and teach them what to think about in regards to sex. And to take the time to get out ahead of it, we want to equip them from an early age. Because most parents zoom in and they have a talk during the teenage years and then zoom out because they're too uncomfortable to deal with this. But what I want is a more open family environment where my kids can talk to me about anything. And I establish from early on what a theology of sexuality is. So I like Stanton Brenda Jones, who was the provost at Wheaton for many years. He has a series of books that they wrote that are developmentally appropriate, that introduce you at an early age to what sexuality is in ways that are appropriate as each stage develops. Elementary school kids, or tweens, or teens, later teens. They have books and a parent guide that helps out with that. And so that, therefore, I can help my kids understand what God intends from early on. Then there are a number of resources that you can look out on the market that begins to help us. There are a bunch of books that came out really actually in the last few years in equipping parents to begin to understand how to talk to your kids about sex. Unfortunately, I haven't read all of them, so I can't commend a whole list of them just yet until I read through all of them. But just if you put this into like christianbook.com and just say parents educating kids on sex, there's I think a couple of books will begin to pop up.
So just as a practical question, what good accountability softwares would you recommend for parents or for just accountability partners to connect people and to help people accountable on devices?
There are a number of software programs available online. So just to give you two examples, because the list is fairly long compared to what I actually could name. The golden standard that everyone always talks about is Covenant Eyes, and for good reason, because it's been around for a long time. It has continually worked at updating and making itself more and more user-friendly. Covenant Eyes is a transparency program. It allows your activity online to be exposed to others so that they can hold you accountable. It's good in terms of putting software on every device, but also giving you a monitored browser so you can remove your unfiltered browser and replace that with their browser. But for parents, another option, an example would be Circle. So Circle is a program that puts the filter at the level of the modem so that any device that connects to the internet within your home, for example, is monitored by the Circle software, which you have on your phone, to check on all the devices and adjust all the devices that's within your home. It's just, there are a variety of different programs and a variety of different approaches in doing that. There's a lot of other programs that are geared towards parents in helping to manage their children's technology. So if you plug that into a Google search engine, you'll find a couple of different kinds of options.
Okay, yeah, no, that's helpful. Someone else who's more of a tech guy than myself said with his family, his approach is layers, which is obviously more expensive because most of these things are subscriptions of some kinds. Yeah. He said like within most phones you can set like off explicit content. Yeah. He said then we have Circle and then we do Covenant Eyes and we have a screen. So it sounds a little bit over the top, but then just to really, especially because of technology shifting so much, to know that it's being covered on many areas. Yeah. You had mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about something about 9 marks of a healthy accountability group.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bad accountability out there. So for example, accountability partner can be really militant. They are command, demand, condemn, and that's not a help. You walk away discouraged from accountability like that. Accountability can be passive. So a person actually shows up and is involved, but takes very little initiative with you and doesn't probe and ask questions or follow up. accountability can be spiritually superior, the Pharisee. Like, I'm here to help you, the person who's the addict. I'm the one who's doing well spiritually, and you're my project. Well, that's not helpful either. And then there's what I nicknamed the SEAL Team 6. The person's struggling, and so lets a few friends know, and then they all zoom in, like the special ops team, to help them out in that situation. Well, there's a lot of bad accountability out there. I think that's just examples of some of the bad accountability that's there. And I often help people who are coming to me for help to rethink the accountability. And so I give them parameters. For example, I want their accountability to be tough. I want them to be people who are willing to ask hard and intrusive questions. I want the accountability to be honest and vulnerable, because if you're not revealing what's going on in your life, it's not going to help anybody. So half-truths are not whole truths. You need to show people what's going on, tell people what's going on, and be brutally honest about what's going on in their life. I want it to be local, as in technology right now often allows us to think we can have accountability with people who live nowhere near us. And yet what I want is people in our own local church to be the ones that hold us accountable, because I want them to be the people, I want the accountability people to be the ones I run into during the week pretty regularly, and the people I interact with in my daily life. I want it to be communal. So it's got to be rooted in a local church. So you're going to have an inner circle of people, close friends, maybe a pastor, maybe a discipler. But in order for this to work, it can't stop there. So am I telling the whole community about my issues? No. But do I need to be connected to a gospel community for the sake of my own soul? Yes. And for me to get everything out of it that is possible. It needs to be word-based, so it's got to be rooted in Scripture. Scripture's got to be central to everything that we do. It's got to be faith-driven. So if I'm just simply trying to do this by myself, I'm not doing what's ultimate, which is trusting in the Lord to help me get through this, because I don't have the resources on my own to do this all by myself. It's got to be broad. So if I'm narrow-minded in my approach to sexual sin, then that's a problem, because I'm just talking about the sexual sin. I'm not talking about all the other issues that are connected to my life, because I'm a complex human being. It's got to be mature. So immature accountability will say a lot of dumb things that are going to make the situation worse. And, people who are listening to are immediately are coming to mind things that people said that made things harder, not better for them. And finally, it's got to be prayerful. So I've got to lean on the Lord, depend on Him, in order for me to actually get through this. And so through the Spirit bringing conviction, I'm going to lean on God every single day and say, Lord, I need help. I can't do this on my own. So those are just some markers to help think about what healthy accountability could potentially look like.
And just to close off the podcast a little bit, we really want this project in general to be, centered and leaving people with a taste of hope.
Yeah.
This is a heavy topic. This is probably going to be a very heavy podcast to listen through, just difficult things. So we want to always be leaving people with hope to go forward into things and not despair or guilt or shame or all these other things. So I don't know if you just want to share one or two hopeful words you could offer at the end of this.
Yeah. There are going to be a lot of people who are listening who are in a spot right now where they're convinced that they can never overcome this addiction. And that's a really hopeful and despairing position to be in. But I want to say, I've seen people overcome it. I've not just talked about it, and this is not just theory for me. I've seen people on the other end of finding real victory. And so I love pointing to different elders who I pastor with, who decades ago we showed up as single guys at our church, and a number of us were struggling with pornography addictions. And now they're years removed and even shepherding the church. So I can say, no, I know real men who not only have overcome this problem, but are years removed and living in purity and holiness, now pouring their lives out to care for others in that regard. So there is real change that's possible. So if you're in a place where you think it's impossible, I think that's a lie from the evil one. I think Satan's trying to make you believe that it's hopeless and therefore there is ultimately nothing you can do to defeat this. And if you begin to get some sense that God can change you, that through Christ, that God really can redeem you, that opens up all kinds of possibilities that you can't even imagine right now. But I want to say that God can do that, and in Christ, that He can change you. So what's asked of you is to repent and believe. That's the first step in a long journey in fighting against pornography addictions.
Deepak, thanks so much for joining me on this podcast and just for being part of this project in general. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this podcast conversation. To learn more about the full-length teaching documentary, Into the Light, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and our website at Into the Light Documentary. These are all crowd-funded resources for churches and families like yours.
We love doing these podcasts because they are honest and meaningful conversations. If you enjoyed this discussion, you may also like my podcast, Chats Under the Sun. I have similar conversations with Christians from all walks of life. You can find Chats Under the Sun on Spotify and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.